Good afternoon to everybody. Hyvää iltapäivää kaikille. I will be speaking English during my presentation to enable wider audience to follow what I'm going to say. But first of all, I want to thank the association for giving me this honor to give this lecture here today. And I'm going to talk about disappearances and our project on disappearances that is coming to an end soon. While I have been working on this presentation, Russia has attacked Ukraine and started a war, a violent armed assault on both the military and civilians in the country. In such circumstances, people invariably go missing, both soldiers and civilians, both from their loved ones and from the knowledge grid of the state. Some of these missing are soon found alive, reconnected with their families. Some of them are found dead, while some remain missing, unaccounted for months, years, or even decades. Some of them are never found, never reconnected with their families, and in the state bureaucracies, their disappearance remains a question mark, to be bureaucratically considered as a death at some point, according to the legislation in most countries, but staying in an open-ended liminality for the family members. The horror of disappearance is blurred with the horror of injury, violence, and death. However, I argue that disappearance has a particular place in human culture, imagination, and politics. And the pain of disappearance of a loved one is different from the pain and power of death. Of course, Ukraine is not the only place where protracted wars and armed conflicts push people to vulnerable positions, to being disappearable, to quote my colleague Ville Laakkonen's formulation. Syria, Iraq, Yemen come easily to mind as such places. For this reason, I find it apt to start with my work with the heritage of the war of the 1990s in Bosnia. So I want to open this exploration of human disappearances with an interview quote. Okay. So I start with a quote. Here, a woman of Bosnian Muslim origin, whom I call Sabiha here, speaks to me in Finland in 2013, where she had been living for almost 2 decades at the time when I was speaking with her. I was interviewing her on the disappearance of her husband during the Bosnian War. The armed conflicts connected with the dissolution of Yugoslavia in the 1990s, including the Bosnian War between 92 and 95, is the previous time when outright war was taking place on the European soil. And what she says, she says, I saw my husband for the last time on the 24th of April in 1992. That was the time when the soldiers invaded our town. We were hiding in the woods, but we came back to the house to fetch some food that we still had there. Then suddenly the soldiers came to our house. They took us, me and my daughters, to a bus waiting nearby, and they kept my husband. When a bit later, the bus that was full of women and children drove past the house, I could see my husband there on the courtyard between 2 soldiers. After that, nothing. I do not know what has happened to him. I never heard about him again. And a bit later, she said, not a single day has passed since his disappearance in 1992 without my wondering what happened to him. It does not stop. I have to get to know what happened. I have to be able to bury him. Otherwise, there is no peace, not for me, not for him. Why should such individual experience be anthropologically interesting beyond human compassion? She speaks in a context where she understands that most probably her husband is dead, but without the body, there is no certainty. The quote shows how a disappearance of a family member leaves those left behind with an open-ended expectation in a liminal space between life and death in Victor Turner's vocabulary. In all cultural contexts, there are culturally codified ways of facing death. Mortuary rites and burial practices mark the transition from life to death. Such practices are also connected to cosmological understandings of human life, of afterlife, and the place of human beings in them. And they frame cultural understandings of good death and proper burial. When a person goes missing and is suspected to be dead, there is often a lingering agony that the death of the disappeared is bad death and the missing person has not been properly buried. However, there is more to this, to the disappearances in Bosnia than what can be read from this quote. Many of the 30,000 persons officially registered as disappeared in Bosnia. There were 40,000 people disappeared in the whole area of former Yugoslavia. Most of them turned out to be forcibly disappeared, that is, executed and clandestinely buried in mass graves as part of the politics of ethnic cleansing and of pushing those of wrong ethnicity from the area. In this case, the Bosnian Muslims, or Bosniaks as they are called these days. Moreover, of the 30,000 missing persons in Bosnia, some 80% have been found, located in mass graves, identified and returned to the families for burial and commemoration. This is an exceptionally high number of identifications in a context of mass destruction. The institution that ran the project of searching for and identifying the Bosnians missing was not the state whose citizens the missing are or were, but an international organization, ICMP, or International Commission for Missing Persons, working on donor money. How to understand that? If we believe the Danish anthropologist Finn Stedputat, who says that the governance of death is an important moment for claiming sovereignty, what should we think about sovereignty in post-war Bosnia? Researching disappearances activates necropolitical questions about the management of death and dead bodies. Who exercises power over life and death? Who manages deaths and dead bodies in various contexts? And I will keep these questions of governance and sovereignty with me throughout this presentation. Next, I want to contrast Sabiha's experience with that of a young man of a Congolese background, interviewed by Saila Kivilahti in Spain in 2019. He is a man of migrant background who came to Spain via irregular routes, and Saila was talking with him about his experiences of crossing the Mediterranean, and also especially about one of his friends who had been disappeared during the journey. And what he says. He's speaking in generally about people disappearing during crossing the Mediterranean. If you have traveled with someone, and then if he doesn't call in 1 month, you start to think that he's dead. Often if you know the family, you call them so that they would know that he's dead. Sometimes we are mistaken because people who get to Europe are not always in touch. It might happen that when you have called the family that the missing person is dead, after months he will call, I am alive. But when they arrive and they don't call, when they don't confirm that they arrived safely, they are thought to be dead. When I arrived in Ceuta, I was caught by the Spanish police. So in 4 days, I could not use my cell phone and I could not confirm that I had arrived. My friends in the forest outside of Ceuta tried to call me and thought that I was dead. They did not know how to call my aunt. Luckily, I was released by the police in 4 days. There was a moment when nobody knew. Sila spoke with many people who had themselves traveled irregularly to Spain, many of them witnessing with their own eyes empty boats whose travelers had disappeared and who had lived through the harsh circumstances of the sea crossing. What emerges from these interviews is a social world of ever-present uncertainty, of death and disappearance getting intertwined, a world where also knowledge is fragile, and unofficial relations very important for gaining and transmitting the scarce knowledge that there is available. I have been working on disappearances in different contexts for quite a long time. First, the research project on the missing in Bosnia, and then from 2018, I have been working on the project Disappearing Migrants and Emergent Politics, funded by the Academy of Finland, with colleagues Ville Laakkonen, Saila Kivilahti, Anna Matuska, Mari Korpela, and Dimitri Ollikainen. We have focused on disappearances in migratory contexts, and this project grew from the realization that undocumented migration is the context where large numbers of people go missing from their families these days. But we have looked not only at undocumented migration, but movement, mobility, and disappearances more generally. Finally, my curiosity to understand disappearance as a social phenomenon has pushed me to look at the more everyday and individual disappearances as well. While most of the research literature on missing persons and disappearances focuses on conflicts, crises, and political terror, there are also individuals who go missing from their families and from the state in affluent, politically rather stable societies in the global north during peace times and often in their familiar environments. Including these disappearances in the analysis helps us to understand more clearly both the private and the political dimensions of disappearances. So people go missing for various reasons and for varying stretches of time. Sometimes people disappear from their loved ones, sometimes from the bureaucratic gaze of the state matrix, while their whereabouts are known by trusted friends or family members. Often they disappear from both. Some people disappear of their own will to escape from unbearable circumstances. Some disappear in natural catastrophes, some disappear as victims of crime. Almost invariably, both civilians and soldiers disappear in the chaotic circumstances of wars and armed conflicts. Totalitarian and military governments have used forced disappearances as a tactic to control political opposition and to create submissive citizens or subjects through fear and insecurity. These instances of disappearances are very different from each other socially and politically. However, I suggest that despite of the enormous differences, these instances also do have something in common. They break the normal flow of life and create an absence, often marked by harrowing uncertainty and distress among those left behind. At the same time, I argue that both the political projects of making some people disappear and the political project of investing in the search and identification of the missing both point to profound questions of power over life and death, of governance and the state, and of the recognition of people by the state and both powerful structures of governance. To go further, I suggest some tentative theoretical frames to think about disappearances from anthropological perspectives. Mary Douglas famously argued in Purity and Danger that humans as cultural beings think and act through categories. Things that fall between categories are inherently problematic, anomalous, or polluting. People who go missing are matter out of place in Douglas' sense. They are not where they are supposed to be. They are inexplicably away from their normal lives, their work, their communities and families. But they are matter out of place also in a more symbolic sense. People who remain missing for protracted time and are placed between life and death symbolically, emotionally, and even bureaucratically. And such a position is utterly disturbing for those left behind. As Douglas argued, such anomalous positions are powerful because they disturb the established social, cultural, and symbolic order. And reading this sort of productive force of the absence of the missing is the core of my ambition to build an anthropological frame for understanding human disappearances. Not all missing persons are dead. Of the everyday individual disappearances, most are found within 24 hours. Sometimes also people reported missing or feared to be missing by their relatives in migratory contexts or under oppressive governments return alive. However, the longer the inexplicable absence lasts, the stronger the fear among those left behind that the disappeared person is dead. Death as a possibility lingers about whenever somebody goes missing, and this ghostly uncertainty feeds into the power that disappearances have as a psychological, social, political, and cultural force that makes things happen at, in different levels, ranging from emotional reactions to taking action, to organizing the search, and to formulating political demands. Thus, the anthropology of death is a useful frame to think about disappearances. In other words, disappearances are always potential deaths, and as such, evoke the cultural frames for encountering death and dealing with it. So I argue that inexplicable absences have enormous power, which affects the lives of those left behind. They affect social relations, bureaucratic procedures, political processes, and cultural perceptions. So they are productive force in a Foucauldian sense. They push towards the reappearance of the absent in material or in symbolic forms. So I will structure what follows into disappearances and reappearances. So who are people who disappear in various contexts? How to approach this very ephemeral phenomenon? Who recognizes the disappearances? Who names the disappeared in different contexts and in which ways? An NGO, a family organization of the families of the missing, take a very inclusive definition. Anyone can become a missing person according to their understanding. For my mapping of trying to understand the differences between different instances of disappearances, I will start from close by, from Finland. In Finland, some 700 people are reported missing each year. Out of these, from 40 to 50 people remain missing for longer than a couple of weeks. A missing person, or kadonnut, is the word mostly used by the police when investigating such events. In 2021, we interviewed the Finnish police who work with the missing person cases, and I followed with Dimitri Ollikainen a search and rescue training event in Finnish Lapland, coordinated by the Finnish Red Cross, but bringing together the state and volunteers, including the police, the border guard, emergency services, medical personnel, as well as dozens of volunteers, including people like orienters, reindeer herders, people with rescue dogs, different kinds, people with different kind of specific skills who are experienced search and rescue activists participating annually in such events, such training events, and also in actual searches. When we talked with the police, they would say time after time again, sort of similar kind of idea came up. We have to remember that disappearance is not a crime. The ways in which the police in Finland as an institution works with the missing person is shaped by attention at the heart of citizenship in liberal democracies, I would say. On the one hand, an adult, fully capable citizen should be able to make decisions concerning her own life, including the whereabouts and whom to inform about it. On the other hand, the state should protect its citizens when they are in need of protection. If there is reason to believe that the missing person might be in danger, the police should intervene. Moreover, children, elderly people, and people with vulnerabilities, such as depression, mental illness, or specific handicaps, are entitled to the protection of the state. The Janus phase of the state as both a controlling and caring actor becomes visible when somebody goes missing. The police described in their interviews the ways in which they can search for a person when they get convinced that the person is in need of the state protection. The well-established procedures to search for its citizens range from engaging the volunteers very effectively to search in the wilderness, if that is where the person went missing, into following electronic traces in banking systems and border control systems, also across international borders, and cooperating with other states' police. And if the missing person turns out to be dead, the state in Finland is usually very efficient in identifying its citizens, as it has gathered large bodies of information of its citizens, from fingerprints to dental and health records, and it has the means to provide reference samples from family members for DNA-based identification. Within stable democracies with more or less stable rule of law frame, the state does recognize its role as the protector of its citizens, and this care work is extended to dead bodies. However, such an efficient system of recognizing them missing and searching for them stops working at least as efficiently when encountering the unidentified dead bodies of supposedly undocumented migrants in the Mediterranean or elsewhere. Moreover, some researchers claim that, for example, social class or ethnic or racial background may affect the investment in the search by the police in various states in the global north as well, but I don't have actually material on that. But if that is the sort of other pole of thinking about the relationship between the missing person and the state, I will return to the Bosnian case. The Bosnian case with which I opened this exploration was in a way a reversal of a situation where the state acts as the protector of its citizens. Most of the Bosnians who went missing during the Bosnian War between 1991 and 1992 disappeared and died as victims of purposeful violence by those seeking to establish power in the newly independent state of Bosnia and to create ethno-nationally purified population in the new state. Such a strategy of using state power purposefully to disappear citizens or other residents is called enforced disappearance. This legislation has its roots in the politics of military governments in South America, especially in Chile, Argentina, and Uruguay in the 70s and 80s. The Convention for the Protection of All Persons from Enforced Disappearance says, for the purposes of this convention, enforced disappearance is considered to be the arrest, detention, abduction, or any other form of deprivation of liberty by the agents of the state or by persons or groups acting with the authorization or support of the state followed by a refusal to acknowledge the deprivation of liberty, or by concealment, the fate or the whereabouts of the disappeared person, which place such a person outside of the protection of the law. So enforced disappearance is recognized here in this legal framework as a brutal strategy of aspiring to sovereignty through exercising power to take life. It is an individuating strategy targeting specific individuals categorized as a threat to those in power. However, the specific power of enforced disappearance grows from the practice of simultaneously hiding the act of killing and the destiny of the victims, thus creating a space of deep ambiguity and insecurity that affects the community and disturbs political life. Moreover, as a political project, enforced disappearance often reaches beyond the act of taking life. It works also on the bodies of the victims through torturing and humiliating the living abducted and dishonoring and violating dead bodies of the disappeared. The latter disrupts deeply rooted practices of governing the transition from life to death. For example, in Bosnia, horrific pictures of the mass graves and the intermingled bodies were circulating in the public and really really disturbing the imagination of the families of the missing persons, trying to think where their missing loved ones were. Such a tactic has been used by many states and many actors seeking to gain control in a state. And to produce populations that are purified either of political opposition or certain ethnic or racial or religious groups. In these cases, the state actively turns its power against people and rids them of the protection of the law and pushes them from the body politic, disappears them both concretely and symbolically. However, in today's world, many people disappear from their families not as victims of such an individuating force, but rather because of being made vulnerable, being exposed to the possibility of death and disappearance, such as migrants who are forced to take irregular routes and cross perilous terrains such as deserts and oceans. When they disappear, it is much harder to pinpoint a single disappearing agent, a personified perpetrator, although of course there are also cases when that happens. According to the IOM Missing Migrants Project, 47,717 migrants have died since 2014 while migrating, and the remains for more than 20,000 people have not been recovered. These numbers are naturally estimations, as it is clear that under such circumstances, not all deaths and disappearances are reported or recorded by anyone. Migrants who are forced to use clandestine routes often do their best to hide their true identities in order to be able to cross borders. If they die en route, this strategy turns against them. They are hard to identify when they don't carry ID documents or the IDs are false or somebody else's. And sometimes the migrants do not reveal their true identities to their travel companions either. At the moment, migrant disappearances are often approached as a humanitarian rather than a human rights issue, and the definition of enforced disappearance is not applied to them. While the legal definition of enforced disappearances foregrounds the purposefulness of disappearing people, many humanitarian organizations approach the question from the point of view from those left behind, and they talk about missing persons rather than forcibly disappeared persons. For example, the International Committee of the Red Cross, which has a long and influential history of working with the disappeared in armed conflicts, both among the military and the civilians, uses the term missing persons consistently as a term to address disappearances. And in their understanding, the family left behind is the crucial actor, and it is the family who has the right to know what has happened to the disappeared one. This understanding has also been consequential and productive in the hands of the ICRC. The worldwide tracking and tracing system called Family Links has operated for decades. It has helped people in conflict situations, often under chaotic circumstances, to reconnect with family members with whom they have lost contact. One of my Bosnian interlocutors told me, emphasizing her words with very emotional tone, that whenever she sees a Red Cross volunteer in the street collecting money, she donates something, as she was reconnected with her husband by the ICRC. They lost contact during the chaotic escape from the Srebrenica region in '95, and for months they did not know where the other one was. Of course, we're talking about a time before mobile phone became so ever-present as they are now. Such an emphasis on the plight of those left behind characterizes the humanitarian approach to disappearances more generally. The focus is not on why somebody has gone missing, but rather what are the consequences of the disappearances for those left behind. The emphasis is on strategies to alleviate the pain of the families and help with practical problems arising from the fact that the family member has gone missing. The International Commission of Missing Persons is another organization using the term missing person rather than forcibly disappeared person, even though it was founded in circumstances in which force and violence were very much present. It was founded to work with the disappeared of the dissolution of Yugoslavia. But anyhow, they make a distinction between being subjectively and objectively missing. Sorry, I don't have the quote here. But they say, subjectively, a missing person is anyone whose whereabouts are not known and who is being sought by another person or other persons. The term missing person acquires an objective meaning when a person is formally reported as missing. So they emphasize the importance of formally reporting somebody missing. So the ICMP definition points to the distinction between missing from your loved ones and being bureaucratically and officially missing. And the latter requires procedures of registering. So the hinge between private agony and public recognition is important everywhere. The recognition of the disappearance by the police or other state officials or by other relevant actors, such as powerful international organizations, is crucial for initiating the search in all contexts. And the public recognition of disappearances is in the agenda of many organizations working with the issue. Then returning to the Mediterranean, the landscape of actors addressing migrant disappearances and the growing numbers of unidentified dead migrants in the Mediterranean is really unclear. In principle, the states are responsible for dead bodies within their territories. And these days, they do take routinely a DNA sample of all the migrant bodies encountered in their territory, at least to my understanding and to official reports. But very few of them are identified and returned to their families for burials. As the families of the dead are often far away in other countries, and there are no outreach programs to find the families of the missing for DNA samples to be compared with that of the dead person, as was done with the Bosnian disappeared. The DNA remains mute in the archives, and the bodies are buried nameless. Interestingly, most of the successful identifications and repatriations of the dead in the area have taken place via various smaller organizations or active individuals who have invested a lot of time and energy to do that, such as a famous undertaker working in Spain who was successful in repatriating many dead and originally unidentified Moroccans to their families. At the same time, many big international organizations such as the ICRC, the Red Cross, and the ICMP, which used to work in Yugoslavia and is now trying to become a global actor. They both are putting forward initiatives for organizing the search and identification in the Mediterranean. So far, however, nobody has really been successful in creating a smooth and reliable system. If we follow Finn Steppudat's claim that the governance of the death is an important moment for claiming sovereignty, sovereignty in the Mediterranean is contested and confused at the moment. It is remarkable that while the living migrant bodies are constantly searched and identified and categorized with sophisticated technologies that can hear the heartbeats of bodies hiding in trucks, or read their faces with all these face recognition technologies. At the same time, the dead bodies slip through these projects of knowing and remain too often unidentified. Okay, I will go quickly to say something about reappearances. So, as in the beginning, I argued that those disappeared, they tend to reappear sooner or later in one way or another, in one form or another. Sometimes they reappear alive and are reconnected with their families and their social environments. In other times, they reappear as dead bodies or mortal remains, that is, parts of bodies that can be identified as belonging to a certain body. In Bosnia, the mass graves were actively searched for. It is my argument, and I'm not alone here, that the catastrophic failure of the West to protect civilians in Srebrenica in 1995, when more than 8,000 boys and men disappeared under the eyes of the UN troops present in the area, led to the massive investment in the search and identification project in the area. The establishment of ICMP was the initiative of Bill Clinton, and significant amounts of donor money came in to facilitate the search and identification process. The investment enabled a real breakthrough in the identification techniques in Bosnia. For the first time in history, DNA-based identification was used for identifying dead bodies on such a mass scale. There were extensive outreach programs and reference samples for the DNA identification were gathered from family members of the missing, both from those residing in Bosnia and from those living in the diaspora created by the war. While visiting the premises of the ICMP in 2013, I could see with my own eyes a specific computer software identifying a DNA sample extracted from a piece of bone from the mass graves, through comparing it to samples given by close family members. This picture shows refrigerator keeping the blood samples from where the DNA can be extracted. Here is technical equipment used for processing the data. And here is codified DNA information in an archive in the premises of ICMP. As I mentioned in the beginning, in Bosnia, this has meant high numbers of successful identifications and mortal remains being returned to families for burials. Sometimes families got back only a fraction of the body of the missing. One of my Bosnian interlocutors told me that one of his brothers who went missing in Srebrenica in 95, of him they only got one rib bone that was identified, but they still could bury this one rib bone, and at least we know that he died, they say. On the societal scale, the identified dead have reappeared as graves and grave sites, most of them special burial sites turned into memorials. In political terms, this means returning the victims of ethnic cleansing to the political sphere. This has created tensions in Bosnia, and the contestations over sovereignty there continue. In other cases, when no remains are found, the missing return as pictures to be carried in political rallies, such as the famous demonstration by the mothers of the disappeared in Argentina, and similar things taking place in Bosnia and in many other places as well. These pictures are often there to demand that the missing themselves should be returned, either dead or alive. They are linked with political projects that seek to bring the missing to the social and political sphere, make them visible, and claim the accountability of those responsible, be it the local government, the Frontex of the European border politics, or depending the case. I argue that such projects are one of the outcomes of the productive power of disappearance. These are acts of reappearing the missing in symbolic forms. Nowadays, such projects do not work only in real plazas and streets, but also in the internet, claiming the recognition of larger audiences beyond the local. Wanted to show you a web page of one of such organizations that work at the Mediterranean. There are numbers of others who really are claiming the missing at the Mediterranean. But finally, to conclude, in many cultural and religious contexts, there are popular beliefs that if a person is not buried properly and in a dignified way, she will remain restless and return in a ghostly form to bother those living. In Sabiha's quote with which I started this presentation, there was the idea that without a proper burial, there is no peace, not for her, nor for her husband. There are also other kinds of ghostly reappearances in my research data. In 2014, I talked with a young woman of Bosnian origin in Finland. She's a daughter of a man who disappeared during the war and whose body was not found or had not been found by the time of the interview. It actually was found a bit later. But during the interview, the daughter was a child when she escaped from Bosnia with her mother. Now they visit the village in eastern Bosnia during summer breaks. It is located in the area that was heavily affected by the genocidal violence there. She told me that whenever she goes to visit the village, where people who remember her father still live, they keep on saying that they do not need to ask whose daughter or whose child she is. You look exactly like your father, they say. She talked about this with cherished and pride, but I couldn't help thinking, what kind of legacy is this? To live like the reincarnation of your disappeared and forcibly disappeared parent, and going there to that area as almost like a ghostly reappearance. So to conclude, I suggest some directions for an anthropological approach for doing research on human disappearances. First, I suggest that we should look at two directions, both at the production of disappearances, and then at the multiple ways in which the disappeared can reappear. In other words, I suggest that it is important to analyze the ways in which different political projects make some people to disappear or expose them to unprotected zones of disappearability. Secondly, it is important to analyze the productive force of disappearances or absences from the private realm to the public and political projects to search and identify the missing and to return them to the sphere of the social and to commemorate them. And finally, I would say that the anthropology of disappearance needs to be always ethnographic in tone, meaning to be sensitive to the varying cultural, social, and political contexts where disappearances carry different meanings and produce different outcomes. I will conclude here. Thank you.